shift, the stakes are high. The mag breaks it down, no need to sigh. From EU rules to global news, Reg with Meg, your trusted views.
Welcome back to Reg with Meg. I'm your host, Tiffany Brown, and today we're diving into an important international regulatory update you won't want to miss. I'm excited to welcome back our regulatory consultant, Brittany Dunning, to the show. Welcome back, Brittany.
Hi, Tiffany. Thanks for having me again.
Of course. So, with the July 1st, 2026 Swissmedic deadline approaching, companies placing medical devices on the Swiss market are starting to feel the pressure. Today, we're breaking down what this really means in practice. With this fast approaching deadline, what are the most important practical steps medical device companies should be taking right now to prepare for Swissmedic compliance?
Yeah, so I'd say, let's talk about the immediate priorities for Swissmed preparation. So the biggest practical step is to treat Swissmed as kind of a two-part obligation. So first is that economic operator registration in the actors module. And for those less familiar with what economic operator refers to, that includes manufacturers, authorized representatives, and importers, as well as manufacturers of systems and procedure packs. And then that second piece is the device registration within the UDI devices module. A critical clarification is that economic operator registration is already a legal requirement in Switzerland. Swissmedic states that the economic operators must register within 3 months of first placing a device on the Swiss market, and that obligation has actually been in place since May 26th of 2021, with submissions being handled via Swissmed since August 6th of 2024. Some immediate priorities would be, first, confirming which legal entities require a CHRN, which is the Swiss Single Registration Number, and we'll discuss more on that in a little bit. Next is to start preparing device master data for UDI device module, because the device registration is coming up, like you mentioned, July 1st of this year, with a transition period until December 31st of 2026. And of course, that's except for vigilance-related cases where registration becomes immediate. And then lastly, we want to look and make sure that you are establishing a structured upload process. So there's no interface between Swissmed and EUDAMED, as we've previously discussed. So the data does not sync automatically. So users can definitely download the XML from EUDAMED and then upload it to Swissmed, but they need to make sure that they know that there's no direct tie.
That's interesting. So this isn't something companies can wait to deal with in Q2 2026. Looks like actor registration is already mandatory and device registration is coming pretty fast, especially with EUDAMED auto transfer. That's a much tighter timeline than some companies may even realize. Moving on to the next question. If a manufacturer is starting to think about Swissmed, what should their first 90 days of prep look like?
Yeah, so I'd say starting immediately, manufacturers need to look at the actor and role mapping specifically for Swissmed. So what does that mean? That's identifying which entities need the CHRN, which again, like we talked about, applies to the Swiss manufacturers, authorized representatives, importers, and system and procedure pack producers. Then confirming who does not need to register. For example, distributors do not need to register in Swissmed. And then foreign manufacturers are also not required to register themselves, but they do need to appoint an authorized representative in Switzerland. So then the next kind of big step is to focus on the device data preparation. So that's compiling and validating the device data for Swissmed, and then deciding on your upload mechanism. So whether that be that you are going to obtain an XML from EUDAMED or obtain an XML file from your internal data depository. Lastly, focusing on operationalization. So that's defining internal ownership of submissions and updates, establishing procedures for corrections versus changes. And this includes the discard mechanism for incorrectly submitted UDIDIs, for example, and then budget planning. So Swissmedic does indicate that there will be a one-time fee for device registration once the registration obligation enters into force. And then first invoicing will be planned beginning January 2027. However, at this time, the fee structure has still not been confirmed. So that's something that we'll kind of have to continue to wait and see when that information will be available.
That's pretty cool. I like that structure. It makes us feel more manageable instead of overwhelming, at least to me. It's not just upload data, it's mapping roles, cleaning data, and building governance before the July 1st, 2026 hits everyone. So, next question, gonna move into that. Can you walk us through who is required to register in Swissamed, like manufacturers, authorized representatives, importers, distributors, and what each party is responsible for?
Sure. Okay. So, first, let's talk about the economic operator registration. So, Swissmedic assigns a CHRN to, as you just kind of mentioned, all of those Swiss based manufacturers, authorized representatives, importers, and manufacturers of systems and procedure packs. So, this registration must occur within 3 months of first placing the devices on the Swiss market. And some important clarifications to note: an EU SRN does not replace the Swiss CHRN, and distributors do not need to register, kind of as we talked about earlier. Next, let's talk about device registration via the UDI devices module. So, again, those Swiss manufacturers, ARs, and system and procedure back producers are responsible for uploading this device data. And then lastly, it's important to note that importers do not need to register the devices. So their obligation is to link themselves to a registered device record. However, Swissmedic does note that the importer link function is not yet available, but will be announced when that does become mandatory.
I definitely think that distinction is important. Distributors don't register, importers don't upload device data, and the SRN does not equal CHRN. I can see how companies mixing the EU and Swiss process could easily get that wrong.
Exactly.
So, what specific device, economic operator, and compliance information must be submitted in Swissamed, and where do companies most often make mistakes?
Yeah, so I'd say the biggest Swissamed specific mistakes that we see is assuming that EUDAMED data will automatically transfer. So as we kind of, touched on earlier, there is no sync or interface between the two systems. So the data must be uploaded separately. And then confusing corrections with changes. So Swissamed does include a discard function for incorrectly submitted UDIDIs that can't be corrected due to business rules. But this is only for correcting wrongly submitted data, not actually for formal, device changes that occur. Also, unfortunately, companies seem to underestimate the importer linking obligations once that function does become active, and then post go live fee implications. Since those fees aren't still available yet, I think that kind of gets forgotten a little bit, but that's definitely something that manufacturers need to keep in mind. So Swissmedic does refer their companies to its user guide and technical documentation for full data element details. And I highly suggest taking a look at their website for more in-depth information.
Interesting. That discard versus change point is pretty subtle but critical. It sounds like governance and data discipline are going to matter just as much as regulatory knowledge. Yeah, like getting into the next question. Are there different registration timelines depending on device class, legacy devices, or current market status? And what happens if companies miss those deadlines?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Tiffany. So Swissmedic structures timelines primarily around market timing and vigilance status. So mandatory device registration begins on the 1st of July, 2026, this year, and there will be a transition period until December 31st, 2026. However, if a serious incident, FSCA, or trend report occurs beginning from the 1st of July onward, registration is immediate and no transition period will apply. Next, the obligation applies to devices that fall under the MedDo and the IVDO, and to legacy devices that continue to be placed on the market when the requirement enters into force. So, two practical timing scenarios. First, devices placed on the market beginning July 1st must be registered before placement, and that's, within that transition window that we mentioned. Secondly, devices that are placed on the market before July 1st and still on the market after that transition window ends December 31st have to ensure that they are registered by that December 31st deadline.
Wow, so legacy devices aren't exempt if they stay on the market. And vigilance events could accelerate registration immediately. Looks like this indicates that companies should integrate Swissamed registration into their overall risk planning. So, for companies already working with EUDAMED, what aspects of Swissamed will feel familiar and where can they reuse existing data or processes?
Yeah. So, kind of, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but Swissmedic does state that Swissamed is aligned with the EUDAMED modules to help preserve maximum equivalence and minimize effort on the economic operator side. And so that means that the EUDAMED data with the XML download can be utilized for Swissamed. However, it's important to remember that it's not an automatic synchronization. And the reuse applies to format and internal processes, not direct data transfer.
That's pretty cool. So, alignment exists at a structural level. Companies still need, though, a Swiss specific upload process. It's a pretty helpful distinction. So, where does Swissamed differ most from EUDAMED in terms of structure, data requirements, or workflows? And why do you think those differences matter in practice?
So yeah, Swissamed differs from EUDAMED, I'd say, in three key areas. First, again, like we've talked about, there's no direct integration with the EUDAMED data or sync, so a separate upload is required. Secondly, the CHRN requirement, so you cannot substitute the SRN for that. And lastly, the importer linkage workflow. Unlike in EUDAMED, there is a separate Swiss-specific process, but again, as we mentioned, not yet fully available at this time.
Gotcha. So the structure may look familiar, but operationally it's a separate regulatory ecosystem. It's probably where companies underestimate the effort.
I definitely agree.
Based on your experience, what are the most common pitfalls in preparing for Swissamed, and what are some best practices you would recommend to avoid last minute compliance issues?
Yeah, so I think, some common pitfalls, again, assuming EUDAMED equals Swiss compliance, delaying CHR registration, ignoring these vigilance triggered immediate registration requirements. That's huge. Misusing the correction versus discard function, and then not tracking stalled rollouts for things such as, master UDI/DI timing and certain product limitations. So, some best practices. Manufacturers should build an EUDAMED compatible XML export pipeline for the Swissamed uploads. They should be developing a Swissamed lifecycle SOP that covers the updates, corrections, and vigilance triggers to make sure that they're staying on track. And then treating Switzerland registration within Swissmedic as a separate master data governance. So it's separate submission and separate oversight.
Nice, super strong closing answer to the question. Swissamed isn't just another administrative task. It's a governance and data integrity exercise that requires ownership and planning now, not in mid 2026.
Definitely.
And that's a wrap on today's episode. A huge thank you to our regulatory consultant, Brittany Dunning, for joining us again and breaking down Swissamed registration. Brittany, as always, you were incredibly helpful. And don't forget, Brittany is a featured speaker in our own webinar on March 10th to walk through key details and practical tips ahead of the Swissamed and EUDAMED deadlines. Then on May 28th, Swissamed will be hosting a free training webinar on how to register your medical devices in Swissamed. If this impacts you, both of these are great opportunities to get prepared and ask questions. Thanks so much for tuning in to Reg with Meg, and until next time, stay informed and stay compliant. Bye, guys.